want to just touch base about a few more quick logistics. At this point, I think we're all kind of Zoom experts, but go ahead and first of all, if you could, especially if you think you might be asking questions, if you could change your name to whatever it is that you would like me to call you if you ask a question, that would be very helpful. And also if you could include your pronouns, that would be great. So if you hover over the three dots on your picture and you click those three dots, you should be able to click rename. So if you could just change your name to whatever you want me to call you and include your pronouns, that would help me when I'm addressing questions and during the Q&A at the end. Also, if you have it in gallery view, go ahead and put it in speaker view because I'm going to be sharing my screen and showing you a PowerPoint presentation. And I think you'll be much happier with what you see if you are able to see that big. What else? As Sam said, the presentation is being recorded, so please feel free to take care of yourself if you need to leave early, if you need to go to the bathroom. It sounds like that will be available to you afterwards. I will also offer to email you the slides from the presentation at the end if you would like them, and if that feels like a helpful resource. As Sam said, I'll mostly be taking questions at the end, but she and I will also pause periodically to scan the chat for any questions and answer them. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you guys now. Oh, except we are jumping ahead, and there we go. Cool. All right. Oh, and one more thing. I usually, I was just chatting with Sam about this. I usually, when I'm talking in person, do pretty interactive talks. So it's been kind of a growing edge for me to present on Zoom. Because it's inherently less interactive. But if you feel moved to turn your video on, that would make me feel less like I was talking to an empty room. And it would be nice to see some friendly faces. So without further ado, I will jump in. First of all, a little bit about myself. As Sam said, my name is Jennie Steinberg. My pronouns are she, her. I am the owner of Through the Woods Therapy Center. I am dually licensed in California as a marriage and family therapist and a licensed professional clinical counselor. In another life, I was also a licensed mental health counselor in Massachusetts. I launched a group practice Through the Woods Therapy Center, which I'll talk more about in a minute, a few years ago, and I've been practicing psychotherapy for over a decade. My personal career and the career of my business. My personal career and my business focus pretty heavily on working affirmatively with gender, sexual, and relationship minorities. I always disclaim whenever I do a talk about gender, sexual, and relationship minority stuff that I am an ally. I identify as allosexual. I have maybe slight demisexual leanings, but I'm not a member of the ace community. I first encountered asexuality when a close friend came out to me about 15 years ago and was really moved to make this an important piece of my work and my practice. Because I watched her struggle to find mental health professionals who could support her. She's not only asexual, she's also trans, and she is an ASPE. And so the intersection of all those things made it really challenging to find affirming, supportive care from people who got it. It made me really want to become an ACE affirming therapist because I don't think there are enough of us out there. Since then, I have had a lot of clients and friends as well who identify on the ACE spectrum, but ultimately I am not a member of the ACE community, and I really believe that allyship means humility at its core. If I say anything that rubs you the wrong way, if I say anything that feels inaccurate or doesn't reflect your experience, please call me on it. Kindly if you have the energy, but I'm not here to tone police because being called on my mistakes is how I grow in my allyship. A little bit about Through the Woods Therapy Center. In the before times, we were located in an office in downtown LA. Right now, we're exclusively telehealth. We're providing online therapy to clients across California. And when I expanded to a group, it was really important to me to sort of know what I was building. So I developed this mission statement, which is 3 parts. The first is that we're strength-based. And what strength-based means is that we don't believe that our clients are broken. The second is that we are affirming of intersectional experiences. So we are affirming of the entire spectrum of gender, sexual, and relationship minorities. But we also practice cultural humility when we're working with people of color and cultural minorities. We also work with people with disabilities. We work with people who have all different kinds of experiences and the intersection of those experiences. And the third piece is that we're person-centered, which means that we don't come in with an agenda. We work with clients on the goals that the clients themselves want to set. So that's our mission statement. And to hone in on the strength-based piece for a minute, the way that I describe being strength-based, and this comes into play a lot in terms of the intersectionality piece too, is that if you're not harming anyone and you feel good on the inside, you're probably doing okay. And this is kind of my like quick pithy way of saying that, like, there are infinite ways to live a good life, and a lot of people, and unfortunately a lot of therapists, will tell folks that if they're not doing things in a certain way or in the mainstream way, that they need to change what they're doing or reevaluate what they're doing. But I really feel like, you know, if you are hurting, that's not great. We want to help you with that. And if you're taking actions that harm other people, that's definitely not great. And we want to sort of like hold you accountable for that so that you can change the way that you're walking through the world and not harming other people. But other than that, those are the rules. Like, feel good on the inside and don't hurt other people. And so I tell you all of that, all of the things that I just told you, so that you know the lens I'm coming from as I embark on this talk today. A few quick objectives. I want to move my Zoom thing so I can read my own slide. There we go. I want to dispel common misconceptions about how asexuality interacts with trauma and mental illness. These are things that I always talk about when I'm talking to mental health providers about asexuality, but I think are really important to talk to ACEs about as well, because I think that, like, we tend to trust medical providers and mental health providers. And you may be faced with a mental health provider who talks to you about these things in a way that makes you question what you know about yourself. Second, I want to address I want to address ACE-specific concerns about loneliness, both as it affects aromantic and romantically oriented ACEs. I want to explore the impact of intersectionality on the experience of asexuality. Wow, that's a tongue twister. I didn't realize that when I wrote it. And how that interfaces with mental health and wellness, because most people are not just one thing. We all have multiple identities that intersect. And I know a lot of ACEs who have a lot of other identities that impact them beyond just their asexuality. And finally, I want to help you learn how to find ACE affirming providers, how to vet a prospective therapist, and how therapy can support you. Ultimately, everything that I'm talking about today, my big goal is to give you the data, tools, and information that you need in order to effectively evaluate a mental health provider, so that you can be empowered to get real support. And to find somebody who is supportive of and doesn't stigmatize your ACE identity, as well as any other intersecting identities that you may have. Because I think that, like, knowledge is power, and it's really hard to find people who get it. So that's what I'm here to support you in. And I'll delve into some other things too, but underlying everything is I want you to be able to find somebody who can support you if you need support. So let's dive right in and talk about the number one myth that I hear mental health providers talking about when it comes to asexuality, and that's trauma. So the number one thing that ACEs tell me, that ACEs who I've worked with as clients and ACEs who I know in my personal life have told me, is that, the number one thing that these people have told me about seeking mental health services is that almost every single one of them has seen a therapist at some point who's told them that they are asexual because they have had trauma. And if they haven't had trauma, or if they can't think of any trauma that they've had, it must be because they're repressing deeply some trauma that they experienced in childhood. Now, that's not to say that there aren't asexual people who have trauma histories. People across every identity have trauma histories. But what studies show is that trauma actually exists in ACEs and in the general population in similar numbers. Some ACEs have trauma histories and some don't. So to get a little bit theoretical for a moment, researchers are curious about whether trauma is an underlying cause of any non-cis het allosexual monogamous vanilla orientation, right? Like anything that sort of deviates from the norm. Researchers are curious, like, is this nurture or is this nature? And the prevailing theory, at least back a million years ago when I was in college, is that there's a light switch in our brains. And some people don't have this light switch, but some people have a light switch that can be flipped based on your life experiences, trauma, and other things, not just trauma, that makes them one of these non-dominant categories. So, for example, if I am a person who has certain life experiences, I might become trans, for example. But if I don't have those experiences, I will never become trans. And some people don't have that light switch, and no matter what happens in their life, they won't be trans. So that's the prevailing theory. It's sort of this nature meets nurture theory. I actually do not find this to be a useful metric, because here's the thing: every trait that we have in every aspect of our lives is some combination of nature and nurture. So, like, if I'm interested in baseball and I sit with a therapist for long enough to uncover that, like, maybe the reason I'm interested in baseball is that the only time my dad ever said good job to me was when I was playing a little league game. Nobody's going to say, hey, Jennie, let's unpack that so that you can stop being interested in baseball. Or let's pathologize the fact that you're interested in baseball, right? So that's like such bullshit that people throw around when we're talking about things that are less understood, about gender, sexual, and relationship minorities especially. And so everybody's life experiences made them who they are. Like, yeah, maybe you had experiences that affected your identity, and maybe it's just ingrained into your brain chemistry from birth. We don't know. You can't do like double-blind experiments about this. But what's more important than this nature nurture question is how you're received as you walk through the world, and the systems of oppression that you might encounter, and what you make of all this, and how you exist in the world as whoever it is that you are, because whoever you are is not the problem. The problem is often some combination of like how you feel about yourself and how you are experienced by other people in negative ways, which can of course affect how you feel about yourself. And what you make of all this. And so, like, this brings us back, right, to like, if you feel good on the inside and you're not harming anyone, you're probably doing okay. So it bugs me when people, it deeply bothers me when therapists talk about trauma as a foregone conclusion of people who are asexual. But it like bothers me more broadly when people say, hey, you've been through this thing and that made you how you are, so that's a problem. So if you have had experiences of trauma, and if you go to therapy to process your trauma, the goal of trauma therapy is to decrease your trauma symptoms, to integrate your experience of trauma into the way you understand yourself, to connect with your core healthy self, like exactly the same goals that trauma treatment would have if you were allosexual. If people aren't familiar with the word allosexual, I just want to clarify, I'm using allosexual as the opposite of asexual. And so whether you're allosexual or asexual should not affect the way that trauma treatment occurs, although the therapist that you're sitting with may approach it differently if they are not informed about asexuality. If you are seeing a provider who is pursuing the agenda of we're going to heal your trauma in order to change your identity, that is not an ace-affirming provider. If through processing your trauma, your sexual orientation shifts, that's fine. And that can be processed and integrated into your sense of self. Sexuality on a whole is fluid. And like I've seen people go through a number of different identities as they're figuring out who they are. And that's not like it's a phase, it didn't count. It's like, this is how I identify at this point in my life. And then I learned something new about myself, or I have an experience that shifts myself. And some people will be asexual for their whole lives. And for some people, it's part of a journey. Um, if that happens as the result of trauma treatment, that's fine. But the goal is not to change your sexual orientation, right? Like you would never have, like a therapist would never, I would hope, have a gay client come in and say like, well, let's hear your trauma to make you straight, because that would be traumatizing in itself. Another myth that a lot of therapy providers perpetuate is that asexuality is a mental illness, and asexuality is not a mental illness. Being a member of a marginalized group can lead to mental illness. There's this saying, oppression causes depression. Which is absolutely true, that like walking through the world fielding microaggressions and macroaggressions on a day-to-day basis can cause a lot of depression, anxiety, PTSD, even like eating disorders and other things. Um, but um, but asexual is not a mental illness. The other thing that a lot of people can experience that might show up like mental illness is internalized oppression. When you walk through the world and you hear this is the way that you're supposed to be, and you think, but I am not that way, then you start to think that maybe there's something wrong with you, and that causes people to struggle with depression and anxiety and low self-esteem and other things that look like mental illness, but those are not mental illness as asexuality. That is mental illness as the struggle of having to deal with humans being shitty in the world about asexuality. Cussing is part of my self-care. I hope that doesn't bother anybody here. When therapists talk about asexuality being mental illness, they are referencing this diagnosis, hyposexual desire disorder. Up until the most recent edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is sort of the Bible of therapy and psychiatry diagnosis, which you probably won't be surprised by now to find out I have some issues with, is up until the most recent edition, that was defined basically as lower sex drive than general population. This most recent edition, thanks to the advocacy of, I believe it was AVEN, and other groups as well. Sam, was ACE-LA involved in that advocacy? No. Okay. All right. For some reason, I thought I remember hearing that. So it was probably AVEN mostly. Um, they added a diagnostic criteria to this diagnosis. And the diagnostic criteria that they added is that it cannot be diagnosed if somebody has a lifelong identity as asexual. So that's better. It's still problematic, though, that this diagnosis exists, because the fact of the matter is that sexual desire is a bell curve. And trying to place somebody on a bell curve based on like what number of times a day that somebody has sexual desire for somebody, or number of sexual thoughts that somebody has, or number of sexual experiences that somebody has, like the idea that there's some amount of correct desire to have, and anything that deviates from that is diagnosable. That's so deeply problematic. By the way, there's also something in this book called hypersexual desire disorder, which is exactly the opposite. Even among allosexual people, like sexual desire varies really dramatically. So it's not like there is like a way to measure this and a right amount of sexual attraction to have. This is mostly self-report. This is mostly people coming in and saying, I wish that I had more sexual desire. And then the therapist says, well, let's diagnose you with hyposexual desire disorder and put that in your medical records for the rest of your life. And okay, I'm going to pause right now. I'm going to check the chat and see if there's any questions before I move on. Let's see. If you have any questions, go ahead and type them. I'm just going to take a sip of water and give anyone who has any thoughts a minute to type those. Cool. I am not seeing that pop up. So let's go ahead and head back to screen share. All right, so let's talk about loneliness because when I work with asexual clients, loneliness is a topic that comes up frequently, either the experience of loneliness or the fear of loneliness. Um, this is true in equal measure among my ACE clients who are aromantic and my ACE clients who are romantic. And the concerns are different, but the subject is still loneliness. So the ARO clients that I work with wonder, how do I find companionship and support people without sort of the like societally driven structure of a romantic relationship. And the romantic aces that I work with want to know, what if I can't find somebody who will want a romantic relationship with me and who will accept me as I am? So let's start with arrows. Um, there are lots of ways that aromantic aces can combat loneliness, and one is to seek connection in other ways through friendships, roommates, family members, meetup groups, gyms, coworkers, knitting circles, book clubs. Anywhere that people congregate is a place that you can seek connection. Building a chosen family is also a powerful concept, I think. It's the idea of people who are there for each other like a family without a blood or romantic connection. It's somebody who might go with you to a really scary doctor's appointment, or who you would call if you were having a really hard day, which doesn't have to be a romantic partner. And then there's this idea of queer platonic relationships. Queer platonic relationships are non-romantic relationships that challenge the notion that friendships are shallow and secondary to romantic relationships. Queer platonic relationships can be monogamous, like I'm your queer platonic person, or as some people say, I'm your zucchini and you're mine. Or they can be non-monogamous. We're building a group of close people, or I have multiple people who I'm super close with. So this is a way of finding folks to be your person without it being a romantic connection. Before I move on to romantic aces, I want to talk about the idea of building trust, because I actually think that aromantic aces have a leg up on everybody else when it comes to this process. Brene Brown, whose work I really love and whose work I recommend to lots and lots of people. She has a really fabulous TED Talk on the power of vulnerability, if you feel so inclined to seek it out. Brene Brown has this theory of building trust using a marble jar. So what she says is that you start out with an empty jar when you meet somebody, and then they say something that resonates with you, and a few marbles go into the jar, and then they remember the thing that you said the last time you talked to them, and a few more marbles go into the jar, and then they remember your dog's birthday, and a few more marbles go into the jar. And then they don't text you back for like 3 days, and a few marbles come out of the jar. So it's this ever like growing, changing process of how much somebody has your goodwill, based on not a sweeping not like a sweeping gesture, not a grand gesture, but like small incremental bits of trust building over time. And this marble jar, this marble jar can be a very useful barometer of who your people are. It can help you think about, like, well, who are the folks that I really would turn to and trust to not make me feel bad in a bad situation. Like, who builds me up? Who do I know has my back? And here's why I think that aromantic aces have a leg up in this regard, is that sometimes marble jars have the illusion of being like fast tracked to full in romantic relationships when you put a label on that relationship. So if you say to somebody, well, you're my boyfriend now, it's like, well, I guess you're my person, and like maybe we've been dating for like a month and now you're my boyfriend and you're my exclusive romantic partner, and I guess that means I really have to trust you, but I only actually have a month's worth of history with you. I think aromantic aces have the ability to kind of build this trust without, in an organic way, without the pressure uh, to have a label fast track that in a way that can actually be really hurtful and devastating. So I think that that provides the freedom to let this happen naturally. And I just wanted to highlight that because, we talk about what's hard, but as a strengths-based therapist, it's also really important to me to talk about what's good and what's positive. Let's move on to combating loneliness and romantic aces. So I've worked with quite a few romantic aces, and there's a lot of fear that if they aren't already partnered, that they'll struggle to find a partner who accepts them for being an asexual person. Um, you can try to date other romantic aces, but there's a limited dating pool, and it can be hard to identify other aces and meet other aces. Um, and if you are dating people who are allosexual, there are a lot of questions about like, how and when do I disclose to a potential partner that I'm asexual? Do I have to compromise part of myself to be in a relationship? Is what I have to offer enough to make an allosexual partner happy? And am I enough or worthy as I am? Um, and anybody watch BoJack Horseman? Okay, well, I love BoJack Horseman. It's one of my favorite shows. And there's a character in BoJack Horseman who is asexual. And after he comes out, he meets this other character, Yolanda, who is oh my gosh, what is she? She's some kind of sea creature. Um, a lot of the characters on BoJack Horseman are animal people, which is fun. But so Todd meets Yolanda and they start dating, and they're very different people. Todd is just kind of like floating around doing whatever he feels like. Yolanda is like very buttoned up and type A. And it's hard to read here on this graphic, but Todd tells Yolanda that he's thinking about building an app for romantic asexuals to date. And Yolanda says, seems like a pretty thin user base for an app. And Todd says to Yolanda, but without it, asexual romantics might end up settling for whatever other asexual romantics, that they just happen to meet, which is exactly what Todd and Yolanda's relationship is. So this sort of like gets at the heart of the challenge of being a romantically oriented ace who is limiting their dating pool to other romantically oriented aces. I mean, the good news, and I say this to clients of all orientations, is that if you are a monogamous person, you really are just looking for one other person. So you don't need a huge dating pool. You need one other person. But while you're looking for a partner, it can be really stressful to worry about finding other people who are asexual. So the positive of dating other romantically oriented aces is that if you find somebody who you really connect with, who happens to also be asexual, your partner will understand your experiences of asexuality. You don't have to play the educator role. You don't have to be the teacher. They'll just like intrinsically get it. The con, as we talked about, is there's a limited dating pool. And I think that when people first come out as asexual, if they're romantic, if they have a romantic orientation, then there is this tendency to just kind of jump into a relationship as soon as they meet somebody else who's asexual because they're so excited to have met someone else who's asexual. But sometimes you then fall into the Todd and Yolanda trap of having nothing in common with somebody other than asexuality. How to meet other aces. There are some dating apps. They're not super well populated. Asexualitic, Asexual Cupid, ASAP. OkCupid has an asexual option. So that's a mainstream app that has integrated asexuality, but from what I've read, it's kind of in an imperfect way. Meetup groups like AceLA are a good way to meet people. Everything is harder for everybody now with the pandemic, but it sounds like there's still a lot going on with AceLA digitally in this very strange time that we're living in. Another option is a mixed orientation relationship. So I first encountered mixed orientation relationships when I learned about straight people dating gay people. But an asexual person dating an allosexual person is also a mixed orientation relationship. These little graphics that you see on this slide are secrets from an app called Whisper. If anybody's familiar with Post Secret, where people mail in their secrets and then they post a bunch each week, Whisper is the same, but it's similar, but it's an app. So these secrets in particular were pulled from a list of whisper secrets about asexuality. Now, I don't want to mislead you. Not all of the secrets on that app were positive. Some of them were people saying, oh, my girlfriend's asexual and I'm worried I'll cheat on her. But I really loved these. I thought these were really uplifting and sweet, and I especially really loved the one on the bottom right that says, "I'm not asexual and I never will be. I love being intimate. My girlfriend is asexual though, and I will never ever try to get physical with her. I don't need sex to love someone, and I respect her." I thought that was really, really lovely. because it doesn't just say I'm willing to give up sex for her. It also says, like, I won't ever try to convince her or coerce her to do something that she doesn't want to do. Um, let's get something really clear. People sacrifice, and I'm going to put sacrifice in quotes. People sacrifice things for their partners all the time. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I'm straight, and I am married to a man, and I am a pretty adventurous person, and my partner is not. And if I were in a partnership where my partner were more adventurous, I might do things that were more adventurous. But I love him, and I've decided that that's not part of what I need out of my relationship. My partner is really ambitious, and his job is really demanding, but we have a 1-year-old baby, and he has decided to kind of like dial back his work in order to focus on egalitarian parenting, right? So people sacrifice things for relationships all the time. And so the dominant narrative is that in a mixed orientation relationship where there's an asexual person and an allosexual person, the allosexual person is sacrificing sex to be in the relationship with the asexual person. And some people will even take that a step farther and say, and so the asexual person should feel pretty bad about that. Or should feel like they are making their partner give something up. I want to highlight that the allosexual partner is not the only person giving something up in that relationship. The ace is sacrificing the opportunity to be with someone who deeply understands their experience of the world. And not enough therapists validate this. Especially like in couples therapy, for couples who have these orientations, the focus tends to be on what the allosexual partner is giving up. And I just want to caution anybody who lands in that couples therapist's office to be really cognizant that your needs matter too. People who love each other navigate mixed orientation relationships all the time in different ways, and they make it work. This can vary by a lot of things. One of the ways that it can vary is if somebody is sexually disinterested versus sex repulsed. Like, so I love going to musicals. That's one of my favorite things in the world. And my current partner also loves going to musicals, but I've previously dated people who haven't. And sometimes, even though they're like, take it or leave it, they'll go with me to see Wicked. And it's like, okay, cool. So you're happy to go to the theater, even though theater isn't your thing. So for some asexuals, that's how sex is, right? It's like you're willing to go to the theater. I also dated this guy in college who was like, I think theater is so fucking boring. I am over it. I just am not into it at all. I think it's stupid. I don't know why people sing randomly. I think it sucks. I'm not going with you to the goddamn theater. So, right. So, and so he was, one might say, repulsed by musicals. That relationship did not last very long. But but for some couples, if an asexual partner is sex repulsed, that might be something that they can work with. There are other things that I love that if I had a partner who was repulsed by them, that would be navigable for me. I also want to note that lots of relationships where both members are allosexual, or it's not a mixed orientation relationship, encounter challenges around discrepancy, like around a discrepancy of sexual desire. That's like a really common challenge that people who are not asexual are trying to figure out in their relationships. That can be related to phase of life, like postpartum stuff, or anxiety about the pandemic leading to somebody not having a sex drive. I've heard a lot of people talk about that. Or it can be related to like an innate disparity, because that bell curve we were looking at earlier, right? Like people fall at all different places on it. And if somebody has a higher sex drive than somebody else, or a higher sexual desire than somebody else, then that's going to cause some friction. But navigating this is absolutely possible, and it is not unique to romantic aces dating allosexual people. And then another way that people choose to navigate these mixed orientation relationships is through polyamory. Now, please don't feel, if you are an asexual person dating an allosexual person, that you have to consent to this. You do not have to consent to this, and it should not be something that is taken on through guilt or coercion. I have worked with a lot of poly clients, and some of my poly clients are very, very happily poly and there to talk about other things. And some of my poly clients are there to talk about how their partner decided that they weren't having enough sex or they weren't getting other needs met. And so usually the client that I'm seeing is the person who was sort of talked into this, not the partner who did the talking into, though I've seen both. And so they owed it to them to open up the relationship. Nobody owes you. You don't owe anybody an open relationship if you don't have to do it. That being said, polyamorous relationships can be very satisfying for people if they are practiced with an extraordinarily high amount of communication and emotional intelligence. But those things really, really are very important. Also, I also wrote this is important. Consent is a huge part of this. If you are in a relationship and you were thinking about opening up your relationship, there are lots and lots of great books on the subject. More Than Two is one. The Ethical Slut is an older one, but I think still has some really good nuggets. Don't try to wing it. Do some research. If you don't have the patience for a book, at least read a bunch of blog articles and talk to people on some forums, because people have made all of the mistakes that you are inevitably going to make if you try to do this and reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of resources out here for how to do this, and communication is so important, and you can really blow up your relationship if you try to open it up without being deliberate and cautious about it. And I want to reemphasize that in polyamory, in a mixed orientation couple, the goal is to help everyone get their needs met, not just the allosexual person. So people might seek all kinds of things from a secondary or tertiary or whatever relationship. And sexuality is only one of those things. You could also seek an intellectual connection. You might have an extrovert introvert dynamic where you want to go out and do things all the time. I mean, not now, but and other times want to go out and do things all the time, and your partner really just like needs to recharge a lot, and so you think, well, I'm going to go get a secondary partner and I'll have somebody else to go do stuff with me. If there had been enough good things about that relationship I mentioned in college where my partner hated musicals, it might have been really nice to be in an open relationship so that I could have a secondary partner who was my musical theater buddy. You might have interests that are different than your partner's interest, and want a romantic connection with somebody who you can seek those, who you can pursue those interests with. You might just want variety. That's another need that can be met. So there are all kinds of needs that can be met by opening up a relationship, and it's not just about sex. And so again, I mean, I cannot emphasize this enough. If you open up your relationship, or even if you're in a mixed orientation relationship with somebody who's allosexual, their needs are not the only needs that matter. Your needs matter too. I'm going to put this up while we're on the topic of polyamory, which is an unbelievably, I mean, this Venn diagram, I guess it's 10 years old. I just noticed the copyright says 2010. And that is all of the ways that you can be poly. It's actually probably not all of the ways that you can be poly. It's probably just like a strong sampling of the ways that you can be poly. Polyamory is extremely complicated, intricate. And I'm going to leave that up for you guys to look at while I check out the chat to see if there's any questions. And if you have any questions, go ahead and type them. What's your favorite musical? Thank you for asking that. Oh, Axolotl. Oh my God, I knew that because I got it. Sorry, I'm responding to different things. So first of all, yes, Yolanda is an axolotl, and I knew that because I had an app when I was pregnant a year ago that told me what cute animal my baby was the size of each week, and he was the size of an axolotl one week, and I saw the axolotl and I went, oh my God, that looks like Yolanda. So I did know that at some point. Thank you for the reminder. And as far as my favorite musical, it's so hard to choose one. I'm really into The Prom lately, which a lot of people have not heard of, but it's coming out as a Netflix movie in December. And it is about a bunch of Broadway stars who swoop in to interfere when they find out that a teenager in Indiana was not allowed to bring her girlfriend to the prom. And it's like moving and funny and lovely. And you should watch it when it comes out on Netflix. Okay, this is here we go. We have some questions about the talk as I get off on an axolotl and a musical theater tangent. Okay. Okay. Is being naturally monogamous okay? Is it a real thing? I feel guilty about being monogamous sometimes. It is absolutely a real thing. It is absolutely okay. I think that there are people who are genuinely poly. I think that most people in our culture are probably inherently monogamous and experience a lot of feelings of jealousy and guilt when they think about their partner dating other people and really struggle with that. I know that as much as I love my poly clients and friends and help them navigate challenging situations in a um, in their poly relationships. Um, like I'm monogamous completely. I would have a very, very hard time being in a polyamorous relationship. So yes, it's absolutely a real thing and it's absolutely okay. How to deal with your own guilt when your partner is also and never pressures you. Oh, sorry. I assume that meant it says also, but I assume that means when your partner is allosexual and never pressures you, but everyone else feels sorry for them. I guess I'm curious, and this is so therapist-y, right, to answer a question with a question, but I'm curious, what does your partner say? Um, what does your partner say when other people say that they feel sorry for them? Um, like, how does your partner respond to that? Because it's possible that your partner's responses about that are feeding into um, like feeding into your feelings of guilt. And um, and even if your partner is saying to you, like, I love you, I accept that you're asexual, I'm fine with that, but then saying like, but then like other people are saying like, hey, I feel really bad for you because you're with this asexual person, and then your partner's going like, oh yeah man, like it sucks but we make do, like of course you're going to feel guilty. If your partner is not doing that, if your partner is sort of like uniformly supportive, then then it's a question of like your internalized ace-phobia probably, because you are picking up on this message that this is what you're supposed to offer to your partner. I hope that was helpful. I feel like I was kind of all over the place in that response. If you have a follow-up question, feel free to type it. I remember the prompt from last year's Thanksgiving Day parade. um, I'm not reading aloud anything that's not a question, especially if it was sent to me privately, but I just want to let you know that I'm reading your comments. I appreciate them. Oh, they tell you, not her. Okay. Um, okay. So to the sort of follow up, they tell you that they feel bad for your partner. I guess I would work on having a stock response for that. Like if you hear it a lot, I would build something that is like a joke with some oomph behind it that deflects the conversation and makes the person, I'm not sure exactly what the response is, but something that's like um that, yeah, something that has some kind of like that just shuts the conversation down in a way that um people just shut up, because that's other people's issue. It sounds like it's not a problem inside your relationship. It sounds like it's a problem because other people can't conceptualize what that might be like. And ultimately, when people are saying that to you, it's not about you and your partner. It's about them. It's about how they can't imagine being in a relationship where they're not having sex. And like, that's cool. You're not in a relationship with them anyway. Um, let's see. Oof. Um, Thank you to the person who alerted me that More Than Two has some problematic things behind it, and one of the co-authors has caused some harm. I appreciate your letting me know that. Um, Somebody asks, does it even make sense to date allos if you are an ace? Are there really people out there, especially older folks, that would be okay with no sex if they are allo? That's a good question. And of course, it depends on who you're dating, right? There are I think that what I hear you asking is not like, is there one person who I could find that I could connect with in this way? But like, everybody I've ever talked to who's of any orientation who's dated has talked about how stressful dating is. You have to like sort through a bunch of really tough people. And when you're ace, you have the added challenge of having to have a conversation of about like, by the way, I'm asexual. And like, when do you do that? Do you put it in your OkCupid profile? Do you disclose it on the first date? Do you wait a few dates and then tell them? Do you just sort of hope they won't ask you for sex and that the problem goes away? Like, how do you approach that? So it is a really complicated thing to do that. And you said especially older folks. I'm not sure what you mean by older folks, but I think that there are probably people of every age. Look, connection is why we're all here. Even if you're aromantic, connecting with other people is meaningful. And if you are a romantically oriented ace, people want things out of relationships that aren't sex. It's just that like the way that the way that that like I hate to talk about like the media because it's so cliche, but like the way that the media packages relationships is that it's all about sex. I mean, there's a lot of problematic ways with a lot of problematic things about the way that relationships are depicted in the media. But specific to this talk, the focus on sex being like the only way that things that people can like solidify their status as being romantically involved, it's deeply problematic and it's not accurate. I like if sex went away from my relationship, I would still have a meaningful relationship with my spouse. And I think that there are people who want the connection, and if they really connect with you, the sex will be unimportant to them.
Hmm.
Let me see. Okay, the person who commented about more than two says that I'm welcome to share the comment. So I just want to read this aloud. It's about more than two and polyamory. I'm learning a lot and happy that you included polyamory in your presentation. However, I did want to express concern over more than two, although it does have some good ideas. One of the co-authors, Franklin, I don't know how to pronounce their last name, Vo, I assume, Veaux, who also made the current diagram. Oh, so they did, has stated that the other co-author abused her and that the book has caused harm. So, all right. So proceed with caution when it comes to more than two. But there are a lot of resources online if you're looking to learn more about polyamory. And yeah, there are a lot more aware folks, younger, not so much older. If I'm not reading your comment aloud, I'm still seeing it. All right, I'm going to go ahead and head back into the talk. But I will check back in with the chat in a little bit. Okay, let's talk about accessing mental health. Oh, no, just kidding. Wait, what? Did I lose a page? Sorry, I lost a page. Let me pick it up. I threw it on the floor. I wasn't ready to do that yet. Okay, let's talk about intersectionality. So, intersectionality is the idea that your experience of one identity is impacted by your other identities. So, for example, I am a white cishet woman, and as a woman, I am a member of a marginalized and disenfranchised group. But if I were a Black woman, I would experience my femaleness differently. And if I were a Black lesbian, I would experience my sexual orientation and my race and my gender differently. So all of these things impact each other. We're not just, none of us are just one thing. We're all a complicated, interwoven combination of identities. And so if you are a member of multiple marginalized groups, that makes it harder to find access to safe spaces. So using the example of the Black lesbian that I mentioned a minute ago, she might show up in Black spaces and find that she encounters homophobia. She might show up in queer spaces and find that she encounters racism. So it makes it harder to find safe spaces when you have a lot of intersecting identities. It also makes it harder to find competent care. So I want to take a look at how asexuality intersects with other identities. And something that you're going to see as a theme a lot, so I'm just going to say it up front, is that a lot of marginalized groups experience various assumptions about their sexuality. And some marginalized groups are desexualized or are fighting to have their sexuality legitimized. And so something that's going to come up again and again as I go through the following slides, and I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record, is that some of these groups may struggle to embrace asexual members because they have had to fight so hard to have their sexuality recognized and legitimized. And it's not okay to discriminate against asexual people if you're a member of one of these groups. But they come by it in a way that, like, if you pause and think about where they're coming from, makes sense. It still sucks. But I just want to sort of put that out there as a blanket statement because we're going to encounter it several times in the next few slides. So let's talk about asexuality and binary cisgender. So cis women are thought of often as a Madonna whore dichotomy. There's an emphasis on women needing to be sexually attractive. So what does it mean when being conventionally attractive for the purpose of attracting a sexual partner isn't a thing that matters to you? Like, how does that challenge people's idea of femaleness? There's also this perpetuated stereotype of women having to be coerced into sex or being reluctant sexual partners. The sort of like haha gender jokes about like, oh, you know, my wife doesn't put out enough or whatever. And so like that, um and so if you are a cis woman who self-identifies as asexual, you may find that you are encountering a lot of people who don't believe you and who just try to tell you that all women don't really like sex. Cis men are often viewed as insufficiently masculine if they're not pursuing sexual conquests. So what does it mean to be a man, to have masculinity, when you don't care about bopping a partner, especially a female partner, over the head with your club and dragging her back to your cave to have your way with her, right? Like how like what does it mean to be a man when that's not something that you value? And there's this idea that came out a couple of years ago, and I want to say it was out of Stanford, though I might be wrong about that. And the idea is this thing called the man box. And basically what they did at whichever university it was, I'll have to look that up. I made a YouTube video about it recently, and then I totally forgot what school it was that did this research. You guys don't care. You just care about what the research says. So anyway, at whatever school it was, they made a list of attributes that were traditionally viewed as masculine, and they called it the man box. This is things like being aggressive, being homophobic, being a person of sexual conquests, being a person who is argumentative or who's loud. These attributes that people value and associate with masculinity, which, like, if you put them into a human body and made that person president of the United States, you might have what we have right now. So you've got the man box. And they looked at the man box and what the impact of it was. And they found that people who were highly associated with the traits in the man box, unsurprisingly, had a higher incidence of violence and like sexual inappropriateness, sexual harassment. But maybe a little bit more surprisingly, although not to me, also had a really high incidence of depression and suicidal ideation. So these are traits that are deeply harmful, not only to other people, but also to the people in the man box. But it's also our culture's idea of what a man is. And so part of that is being like deeply obsessed with sex, especially not especially, only sex with women, only cis women specifically. And so if you are a man who is asexual, if you are a cis man who is asexual, then you are kind of like bucking the man box, and that might have some implications for the way you're perceived as you walk through the world. Asexuality and trans and non-binary gender. So like society has this weird obsession with the sexuality of non-cis folks. I think part of it is they just don't understand how it works and there's curiosity. I think part of it is that like like trans women are often depicted sort of in the same breath as overly sexualized and like unnatural to have sex with. There's also a lot of confusion about asexuality and agender being the same thing. And as we talked about in that first slide about intersectionality, some trans spaces may have a hard time with asexuality because of the societal notion about sex with trans and NB people being unnatural or like an obscure curiosity. So if you are an ace and also a trans or non-binary person, you may encounter some pushback in those gender diverse spaces. Intersectionality with other queer identities. You know, we already talked about trans stuff, so this shouldn't say queer identities. This should say and other sexual orientations. So if you are an ace, you can be aromantic, but you might also be homoromantic, biromantic, panromantic, etc. Heteroromantic is not on the list for some reason. Oh, because that does not fit the slide. That is the reason. And Dan Savage is a really good example. If you guys know who he is, he's like a big sexuality educator and he's a gay man and he's like a voice for queer people, but not if you're ace, because he's really come out in a really pathologizing way and said that ace people should not be considered part of the queer community. And I think that what this boils down to is the defensiveness that we were talking about, that like particularly LGB folks have fought really hard to have their sexuality recognized as an okay and valid thing. And when they embrace aces into the fold, there might be some pushback about that because of the fact that they fought so hard for the right to have the kind of sex they want to have. And so yeah, I mean, in any group, there's going to be in-group bigotry, fighting, and vying for safe space. But like, this sucks, and it's not okay. And aces absolutely have a seat at the table of queer identity. But if you are an ace who is also homoromantic, biromantic, panromantic, etc., and you show up in one of these spaces, you may receive some pushback for that reason. So that can be really challenging. Race and culture. A lot of cultures have expectations to conform to heteronormativity. A lot of cultures have a strong emphasis on marriage, procreation, wifely duties, being fruitful and multiplying. I have a friend who's in cantorial school who just had to write a term paper about what is fruitful enough in the phrase "be fruitful and multiply." Like what? Some cultures define a woman's value by her marriageability. This is still true. I meet with clients all the time. A lot of clients from like Middle Eastern and like Southeast Asian countries in particular who like they grew up hearing that their worth or their value was how marriageable they are. And being asexual like by these conventional notions compromises that. So if you're a member of one of these cultures, you might find that really challenging. And it might be just like an additional thing to face when you're thinking about coming out to family, for example. There's also a lot of assumptions about race and sexuality. So Black and Latinx people tend to be heavily sexualized. There is also a stereotype that Asian people are like not very sexual, especially Asian men. So these are other things that you might be noticing as you navigate these spaces if you are a member of these communities. Somebody is unmuted. If you are that person, do you mind just muting yourself real quick? Because I keep hearing your reactions and I love it because it reminds me of being in an actual room talking to people. But I'm a little concerned that it might be distracting on the recording. All right, let's talk about asexuality and disability. This is another one of those communities that has like fought really hard to be recognized and allowed to have a sexual identity. It's possible that advocacy groups who advocate around disability rights may reject asexuality because they've had to fight so hard for recognition of their sexuality. some people also who experience physical disabilities that impact their libido or the functioning of some of their body parts, and this can get conflated with asexuality. And people who are allosexual and disabled, but who experience some of this, might get very defensive around the idea that there are disabled people who are asexual. People also might assume conflation of these two things, like, oh, you're asexual because you're disabled, if you are both of those things, or, oh, well, you're asexual because you can't find a partner who wants you with your disability, which I don't think I have to say is deeply, deeply problematic. And then finally, asexuality and class or socioeconomic status. A lot of people write off asexuality as an upper middle class trend. Somebody asked a question a minute ago about age, and I think that like that gets the same sort of stereotype that like this is a millennial thing. It's a young people thing. This isn't something that transcends all these different demographics, but of course it is. This is asexuality, just like any other sexual orientation, is not a thing that that is specific to a socioeconomic group or an age group or a generation. Um, I wonder if some of this, sort of, if some of this misunderstanding around socioeconomic class and asexuality comes from the fact that being unpartnered in our very expensive society, and especially, I don't know if everybody on this call is in LA, but especially in LA, is a really expensive thing. Like affording a place by yourself is very expensive. You don't get tax breaks if you're not married, and so there is, aside from the fact that ACEs might lack access to some of these financial benefits that people who are partnered and in relationships have. I also wonder if that impacts sort of the broader perception of asexuality as an upper middle class trend. I'm going to go ahead and glance at the chat. I've seen it flashing a few times before I move on. Okay, somebody messaged that they have to go. If you have to go, I am going way, way over on time. I hope that's okay with you. But if you do have to go, please do. I know that ACLA is recording this so that you can go ahead and pop back in and get the good stuff about how to find a therapist when whenever you have time. I know that it's getting pretty late right now. So, of course, if people need to pop out and get ready for bed, please feel free to do that. Okay, let's talk about finding a therapist when you are asexual. These are some of the things that I have heard clients say other therapists have asked them. And it's not great. It doesn't make it easy to find somebody. Most ACEs that I know who have seen therapists, unfortunately, have had at least one negative experience. And even those who have had really positive experiences often report those positive experiences with negative features. So, for example, a client once said to me, oh yeah, that last therapist I saw, she was the one who put the word asexuality on my radar. It changed my life. It was really amazing. I looked into it and found it so resonant, and like it was wonderful. But then in the next breath, she told me that I must be repressing whatever trauma caused it. So sometimes even really positive experiences can have sort of negative or damaging features. This particular client was like, no, that's not true. I didn't have a traumatic childhood, but not everybody has sort of like the sense of self to be able to fight back against a person in a metaphorical white lab coat who's telling you who you are. How to find ACE affirming providers. There are no known directories for ACE affirming therapists. I did a Google deep dive the other day when I was working on this presentation. Oh, I'm seeing a flashy thing and I wonder if I'm wrong actually. Okay, it is not about that. I will circle back to this comment when I next take comments. I was wondering if that was somebody being like, no, there's this directory. And I'm like, oh my God, how do I join it? Yeah, there are no, I don't know of any directories for ace affirming therapists. So what you may need to do is start by searching for queer affirming therapists and then just like interview them intensively. So Psychology Today is sort of the go-to directory for therapists. It is the biggest directory. It has the most therapists. It has the best SEO, so it'll pop up in any search that you do for therapists. It has some issues in terms of the way that it handles various things. It took a very long time to allow providers to list that they focused on working with transgender clients rather than transsexual clients. So like they're behind a curve on a lot of things, but they're the biggest directory. And so, and you can narrow it down to queer affirming therapists in Psychology Today. You can also Google asexuality therapists. Apparently Through the Woods shows up on the first page when you do this because of a blog article I wrote a while ago. So yay for that. Always nice to see that. And then what I really want to encourage you to do is not just find any therapist who says that they are queer affirming, which could mean anything from like they went to a program that specializes in working with queer people in grad school to they worked with a gay client once. What I really want to encourage you to do is like intensively ask questions when you have a phone consultation. And I do encourage you to have a phone consultation rather than just scheduling an appointment by email. So I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that I screen all the applicants to my practice for competence in working with gender, sexual, and relationship minorities. And part of my interview process before I meet somebody in person to interview them is a vignette that I give them. It's a 2-page vignette, and it's about a white cis male client who is married to an Asian bisexual cis woman. There's a disparity in sex drive. He's demisexual, but it's not explicitly stated in the vignette. And so they open up their marriage. She dates several people. He doesn't for a while, but then he meets a trans woman, starts dating her, and eventually has sex with her. So like, what's going on in that vignette? And I ask 10 really hard-hitting questions at the end after I send them this 2-page thing that basically asks them to provide perspectives on this relationship. I've declined to hire people because of pathologizing responses, especially about the ace character and the trans woman. And so, at Through the Woods, I do the vetting for you, which is great. We are not accessible to everybody because we're not in network with insurance companies. We and not everybody, back when we were just doing in-person sessions downtown, not everybody's conveniently located to our office. For those who want to go to other places, I recommend you ask the hard-hitting questions yourself. So here are some examples of questions you can ask. What's your experience working with asexual clients? How would you describe your belief system around asexuality? I have a trauma history, or I don't have a trauma history, and knowing that I'm asexual, how would that be likely to impact our work together? What are your initial assumptions about me based on my asexual identity? In addition to being asexual, I also identify as romantic orientation or other intersecting minority category, and what are your thoughts about that? So you'll notice that these are open-ended questions. They're not yes/no questions. And like I said a minute ago, I recommend that you request a phone consultation. Most therapists will do that. They'll give you like 20 minutes on the phone before you book your appointment, and then that you don't just book it by email. But I also recommend that you don't say in your initial email to book the phone consultation that you're asexual. I recommend that you come out to the person you're talking to on the phone. And the reason for that is that that's the best way to gauge how someone initially reacts to hearing that you identify as asexual. You can kind of like listen to what happens in their voice if they don't know from your email already that you're going to tell them that. And these questions are just to get you started. You can ask all kinds of different questions. And of course, whatever your specific situation is and whatever's bringing you in with, which may or may not have to do with your asexuality, you will probably want to ask questions about that. Here's some ways to know you're in the right office. First, the therapist accepts your identity at face value. They don't respond by asking, have you ever considered that you might just be gay? Or have you had your hormone levels checked by a doctor? Now, it might be worthwhile to have your hormone levels checked by a doctor if this is a new thing for you and it's a change and you're trying to piece together what's going on and rule out other things. But it's not their first reaction to you saying that you're asexual. And certainly if you had a lifelong identity as asexual, that shouldn't be the thing that they're asking you. Next, Your therapist may introduce words or concepts that help you clear up your identity, things like gray sexual, demisexual, queer platonic, but doesn't push any of this on you. So it's good if a therapist says, it sounds like you're saying that you have a sex drive sometimes, but that it's extremely rare. Are you familiar with the term gray sexual? It's bad if the therapist says to you, oh, obviously you're gray sexual. That's the word that describes your identity. That's what you are, right? It's good if the therapist says to you, hey, it sounds like you and this friend are very close and support each other heavily, even though it's not a romantic relationship. Have you ever heard the word queer platonic? It's bad if the therapist says, oh, you and your friend are queer platonic partners. You're each other's zucchini, right? Like, so there's a difference between suggesting verbiage and like introducing words that you may or may not be familiar with and pushing an identity or a label on you. Next, the therapist validates your experience of your identity rather than trying to change it. So that's true of both your identity itself and your lived experiences with your identity. If you express that you feel broken, the therapist actively disagrees with you. This is a huge one. This is a fine line because you want your therapist to validate your feelings, but you don't want your therapist to allow you to feel broken or to describe yourself as broken. This might be especially common, feeling that you're broken, if you are newly identifying as asexual, or uncovering this about yourself, or being honest with yourself about the first time about how you feel and how you identify. If you say that you feel broken, your therapist should say something like, "You experience the world differently than other people. Yeah, that's true." But it doesn't mean that part of you, it doesn't mean that part of you is broken. Sexuality is a spectrum, right? So they should validate your feelings, but not allow you to just sit in the sense that there's something inherently wrong with you. And then they should give you, it's called psychoeducation, which is a fancy word for just like teaching you stuff, about how there are many different ways to experience the world and many ways to live a good life. And this is the same for ACEs, and this is true for everybody, right? So your therapist doesn't let you describe yourself as broken and sit in that and marinate in that until it's all you can think about yourself. If you're in a mixed orientation relationship, the therapist focuses on making sure your needs are met, not just your partner's. I know I sound like a broken record here, but it's so important and it happens so much. Emphasis, emphasizing an asexual person's needs matters. An allosexual person in a mixed orientation relationship is not the only person who is challenged by this dynamic or who feels like they might be giving up or sacrificing something. If you are in couples therapy and you're in a mixed orientation relationship, the couples therapist should ask the asexual partner, should ask you, it's true that your partner who's allosexual is not having sex and not having the experience of being sexually desired. What's challenging for you about being in a mixed orientation relationship? And they should turn to you and allow you to voice what your needs are and what your experience is of unmet needs as well. Unmet needs that an asexual person in this relationship might have are alleviation of a heavy sense of guilt around the idea of sex, validation that they're enough for their partner, a desire to have their asexuality deeply understood, assurance that their partner doesn't resent them for asexuality, all kinds of things. Next, your therapist encourages and validates the importance of consent and does not push you to compromise. God, this is so important. Your therapist should encourage you to only have sex if you feel like it. And feeling like it can mean that you love your partner and want to do something nice for them. Feeling like it doesn't have to mean you have an affirmative desire that isn't naturally part of your identity. But they don't tell you that you made your bed and now you need to lie in it, or that this is what you signed up for, or that you owe this to your partner, or that they're giving up so much for you. Can't you just do this once for them? Like, that is not a therapist who values your right to consent. There's also this idea of enthusiastic consent, which gets really sticky around asexuality because there's been this move from no means no to yes means yes to fuck yes or no, right? And fuck yes or no is this idea that if your partner is not all in and like actively, rabidly desiring sex with you, that's a no. But an ace may never have that experience, but may want to like go to the theater with their partner, right? Like to throw it back to the metaphor I used earlier. They might want to they might want to have sex with their partner because they know it's important to their partner, even though that's not something they desire. And so enthusiastic might look really different for an asexual person than it looks for an allosexual person. And so it looks more like I really care about you and want to do this, and less like I need you badly right now. So like a good ace affirming therapist will be able to validate that as well. And also on the subject of consent, an ace affirming therapist will understand that partnered or unpartnered, you may never want to have sex. You may be sex repulsed, and they do not interrogate this piece of your identity like it's something that needs to be changed. And then finally, the therapist believes your account of your lived experiences. If you encounter microaggressions as you walk through the world, rather than saying, "Oh, you're probably being sensitive, they just didn't mean it," they validate that you've had this experience. That's how to know you found an ace affirming therapist. Here are some signs you're seeing the wrong therapist. The therapist tries to talk you out of your identity. They say things like, "Oh, if you just met the right person," or "Maybe you're just repressing that you're gay," or "It's a side effect of your depression or your PTSD," or "You have an obligation to your partner." Your therapist diagnoses you as asexual. Again, this is hyposexual desire disorder. No one can diagnose you as asexual, just like no one can diagnose you as gay or trans. And remember, you can advocate for yourself if you find yourself in this office, or if you're seeing a therapist for a long time and you really like the therapist, but they make this mistake, because therapists are human, and maybe deserve a little bit of grace around this stuff. Maybe, I don't know, maybe. And just gently remind them that the DSM-5 has a diagnostic criteria that says that you cannot diagnose somebody with hyposexual desire disorder if they have identified as asexual, and that meets the way they describe themselves for their whole life. You don't have to have been calling yourself asexual for your whole life. You just have to go, you have to be like, let's say you're 35 years old and today you say, "I am asexual," and you look back and you think, "Whoa, and I kind of always have been." Like that's enough. So that would rule out their ability to diagnose you with hyposexual desire disorder. As I think you guys know by now, I think it's a problematic diagnosis anyway, but particularly if you're asexual, it's not only problematic, it's inaccurate. Next, the therapist tries to cure you, or integrate sexuality into your goals or treatment plan. Okay, God. If a therapist makes it part of your treatment plan for you to develop sexual attractions or romantic relationships if you're aromantic, if your therapist suggests interventions for you to try to increase sexual attractions, for you to watch porn with a partner, or for you to try aphrodisiacs, or refers you to a psychiatrist in the hope that the meds will fix you, like, run for the fucking hills. That is not a good therapist for you to be seeing. You're not broken. You don't need to be fixed, but like, you especially don't need somebody to give you interventions that make you, therapy is supposed to make you uncomfortable, but that make you like uncomfortable on the basis of it flying in the face of your identity. The therapist insists they know more about you than you. The therapist insists that they know more about you than you do. That is a problem too, right? Because then they're telling you, this is the therapist who maybe is well-meaning, but says, "I bet you have repressed trauma." Or you're only asexual because of your depression or your PTSD or your anxiety or whatever else it is. Here's a tricky one. The therapist allows you to set a goal to change your sexuality. Now, part of being a person-centered therapist and running a person-centered therapy practice is that we let clients set their own goals, right? Like, I don't come in with an agenda, and I don't want to ever tell clients that their goals are wrong. But that being said, a goal to change your sexual orientation is not realistic. And in fact, not only is it not realistic, it's conversion therapy, which is extremely damaging, and it does not work effectively. It causes clients to repress parts of themselves. It increases depression, anxiety, and suicidality. There's a ton of research on this. Some states have banned it. California has banned conversion therapy for minors. And conversion therapy is in itself trauma. There's a therapist in my network named James Gay, and he's a therapist who, ironically, is gay. And was subjected to conversion therapy as a child. And now his entire focus in his practice is on helping people overcome the trauma of these experiences. So in other words, there is a therapist whose entire practice, and he has a wait list, like his phone is ringing off the hook. His entire practice is helping people deal with the so-called therapy that they got trying to change their sexual orientation. So if a therapist, I would hope that if a client came in and said, I'm gay and I don't want to be, and that's my goal, a therapist would say to that client, like, I can't help you not be gay, but I would love to help you work on like understanding this as part of who you are and integrating this into your identity. And the same thing is true of asexuality. Um, like a therapist should not agree to work with an asexual client to help them become more sexual. If you don't like that you're asexual and you're really struggling with it and you wish it weren't true, an affirming therapist should gently challenge these negative ideas about yourself and that desire to change and work with you to help you accept yourself and integrate your asexual orientation into your identity, not agree to help you try to change who you are. Other signs you're seeing the wrong therapist, the therapist makes the assumption that you either are or aren't aromantic, heteroromantic, homoromantic, biromantic, etc. They make an assumption about your romantic orientation. They make assumptions about whether or not you're sex repulsed. They make assumptions about you being on the autism spectrum. Now, there is a higher incidence of all gender, sexual, and relationship minorities among people on the spectrum. In my experience, this is tied to the fact that people with autism struggle with social cues. So in this case, that actually helps them figure out their identity because they don't internalize the same message that you're supposed to be cisgender, heterosexual, allosexual, monogamous, vanilla as the default, or the only acceptable way to live. So people who are on the spectrum tend to kind of like figure out who they are maybe more readily because they're not combating these social cues that they shouldn't be who they are, which I think is actually kind of wonderful and beautiful. If you're an ace and you think you might have autism, there are people who do evaluations for autism. Great. I think that I encourage you to get diagnosed. I know a lot of people who have, as adults, especially cis women, who as adults have gotten diagnosed with Asperger's, and it's really just like changed the way that they perceive their entire experience of the world, and it's been enormously helpful. But your therapist should not assume that you have autism just because you're asexual. Your therapist should not assume that you want to change the fact that you're asexual. We already talked about the fact that a therapist shouldn't try to change your asexuality. They also shouldn't assume that it's something that you dislike about yourself, because this reveals their latent beliefs that you shouldn't be asexual. And then they shouldn't assume anything else about you, honestly. Like, that's it. Anything else. This might seem obvious, but like the fact that you're asexual does not tell your therapist anything other than that you're asexual. And so if they start making assumptions about other facets of your life, it probably means a couple things. Like, either they don't have a whole lot of experience with asexuality, and like maybe they've known one person or one client and are imposing everything about that person onto you. Or it means that they've been in the field too long and they're really burned out and they aren't working that hard to get to know their clients, which is also just like generally not a characteristic you want in a therapist. Real quickly, I'm super aware of the time. I appreciate you letting me go over. Things you can talk about in ACE affirming therapy. Oh boy, so many things you can talk about in ACE affirming therapy. You can talk about identity questions, coming out, navigating oppression, being outed. I am reading this to you, even though I'm aware you can all read for yourselves. Struggling with invisibility in a heteropresumptive culture, intersectionality, reconciling privilege, the stress of having to play educator, navigating systems while ACE, managing fraught family relationships. Oops, I gave away the punchline. Okay. Managing family relationships, specific trauma, such as threat or actual coercive rape. I am deeply sorry, by the way, if this has ever happened to anybody on this webinar. Social discrimination, religious discrimination, barriers to medical care, and past therapy with non-affirming providers. These are all things you can talk about in ACE affirming therapy. Here are some more things you can talk about in ACE affirming therapy: depression, anxiety, trauma, work stress, life transitions, relationship challenges, body image, parenting stressors, boundary setting, self-esteem, self-compassion, and managing anger, loneliness, friendships, political stress, stuff that literally anybody can use therapy to talk about. But in a space that you know your asexuality is not going to become front and center and pathologized. In other words, ACE affirming therapy is not only important if you are an asexual person who is looking to explore and define your asexual identity, it is also important for you to be able to show up as your whole self and work on dealing with other things that might come up as you navigate the world. Like, if anybody has political stress or whatever right now, I've heard that's a thing that's going on for some people. That's my presentation. I'm going to take questions. While I'm taking questions, and I see that I've seen a few things pop up while I've been talking here. If you would like a copy of the slides, will you please send me a private message with your email address using the to feature in the chat box to select just my name so that only I can see it. And go ahead and put your email address. Also, if you give me your email address, I will also add you to our monthly newsletter list. If you want to opt out of that, I am big on consent in my marketing. So if you want to opt out after your email address, write no newsletter. And I will not add you to the newsletter. I'll just send you the slides if that's what you'd like. So let me go ahead and take a look at the chat box here and scroll up. And see what we've got here.
Jenny, feel free to let me know when you would think it's best to stop recording.
Thanks, Sam. Let's see if there's questions that would be good to have on the recording. And then I will let you know. Yeah, someone is saying here that they've had some pretty negative experiences with therapists being terrible. Apparently there are some good ACE directories. I will have to look into those. Thank you. Those are good to know about. Let's see. Aces and arrows question is read the links above. They're submitted by users, so there's no vetting. Yeah. So so different directories just in general. So there's a question. So somebody posted some directories for ACE affirming therapists, which I did not know existed, and I'm glad they do. But some directories people vet really carefully. Like I've been listed on directories where people ask to have a phone call with me to ask me some questions before they let me list myself. Other directories are just sort of self-identified. So it seems that these directories are just for people who self-identify as ACE affirming. But like the fact that therapists are even thinking about that is a good sign, probably. It doesn't mean that you're not going to find troublesome people on there, but it's a good starting point for sure. Okay, I think, let's see, I'm seeing mostly email addresses here now. Right, so somebody is saying on this chat that I'm just going to read the comment. It says, I find more often that therapists just don't know about it. They're accepting of it, but know literally nothing about it beyond what I tell them. Is there any effort to present this information to associations and continuing ed for mental health providers on a broad international scale? Boy, Sam and I would love to do that. We've done a few talks, and I did one with Izzy too, for groups of mental health providers. Izzy, when you and I did the talk, I think I saw that Izzy's on here. I don't know if she still is. Yeah. When you and I did the talk, it was for a group of mostly like therapists in training at a community mental health center. Sam, I know that you came and did the same talk that I did with Izzy for my staff. But I feel like we did it one other time. Do you remember who that was to?
I don't recall.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, I mean, the answer is like those of us who are passionate about this are doing what we can. And actually, I have a story about this because I went to the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, and they have a monthly meeting where they feature somebody to talk for an hour at each meeting. And I said, I would really like to do a talk about asexuality. And they said, oh, but not that many people are asexual. Most therapists don't need to know this. And they just kind of shut me down. So thanks, California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. That was actually really similar to the response that I got when I pitched a talk about um, working with kinky clients to the Massachusetts Mental Health Counselors Association. So some of these associations are a bit behind the curve on recognizing the importance of these presentations and these subjects. Um,
And I'll just add, as an ACE activist and not as somebody who is a therapist or has any training as a therapist, that coming at it from an ACE activist angle, um, I would say we at ACLA have faced a lot of, I think, what Jenny was just talking about in terms of trying to move the ball forward in big sweeping ways in talking to, maybe the way to phrase it is, larger mental health care provider centers or organizations. I do think it is changing. In fact, I don't know if somebody's on the call who can remind me. There is of like I think it's like the mental health subcommittee of Los Angeles City. There is like there's a subcommittee specifically for LGBTQIA plus mental health that um,
yeah,
we're a part of, and they've been
that's good.
welcoming of us.
That's nice to
But
hear.
yeah, but in general, I think it's like what you said, Jenny. We've been told like like not now,
Yeah.
or we've heard like, oh, you'll come after like trans folks, essentially. Like they're just now moving and starting to
I,
have discussions around treating trans people.
what's so crazy too is that like the research I've said says that about 1% of people are asexual. And if I went to CAMFT, the California Association of Marriage, they're called CAMFT. If I went to CAMFT and I said, I want to talk about bulimia, you bet they'd let me do a talk on bulimia, but bulimia is less common than asexuality. So it's not actually about the incidence, it's about awareness and marginalization, which is crappy. Um, I should say though that the person who kind of gate kept me out of doing that talk for Camped has a podcast, and she did invite me to be on the podcast. So there was a podcast that I did a couple of years ago, and I should listen to it because I actually don't know how much I would like. Every time I do a talk about any queer issues, I like go back and I listen to it, and I'm like, oh my god, I've learned so much. I can't believe I said such and such. And part of it is like I'm learning all the time, and part of it is that like language is changing all the time and the way that people talk about things is changing all the time. So I don't know if it's any good, but that podcast was called The Relationship Show. If you'd like to seek out the episode I did on asexuality there. Um, Recommendations for dealing with non-affirming doctors in general. They don't believe my identity and that I don't have sex. Yeah, that's also something that I hear a lot about seeking medical care. Um, Theoretically, I would say the same as looking for a therapist, but the problem is most doctors won't get on the phone with you. Most medical doctors won't get on the phone with you and like spend a bunch of time answering your questions about their experience with asexuality. I think it really just does come down to a need for broader education in these fields, and like finding a good doctor under any circumstances is really hard, especially like finding a good gynecologist is really hard where you feel comfortable, but and especially as an ace, it's really challenging. Um, and if you are seeing a doctor who is making you feel uncomfortable, find another doctor. Like you're not married to them. And I know it's hard to like, you see a therapist you see once a week and you see a few times and you go, this isn't working. You find a new person and you can decide pretty quickly if somebody's a fit or not. A doctor you might see once or twice a year, unless you have, some physical health problems. And I think it's much harder to vet somebody when you see them so infrequently. But um, yeah, I mean, I guess my best advice is like if somebody really like, there's a difference between being a little bit skeptical and making you feel truly terrible and invalidated. And if somebody makes you feel truly terrible and invalidated, find a different doctor. But this person who made this comment did not say, "What are your recommendations for dealing with my doctor?" They said, "What are your recommendations for dealing with non-affirming doctors in general? They don't believe." So that sounds like you had multiple experiences like that, and I don't know. I mean, maybe if you find a queer doctor, they might be a little bit more likely to be affirming. But it's hard. It's really. I wish I had better suggestions for you here, and I just don't. Um, let's see. talk about experience working with the Q in LGBTQIA. Well, so Q stands for two things, depending on who you ask. Q stands for queer, and it stands for questioning. And I'm not sure which of those you're asking about. Queer I think of as an umbrella term for people whose identity isn't simple or straightforward, or who just want to sort of identify more broadly with the alphabet soup. My favorite acronym I've heard is quilt bag. uh, um, but if you mean questioning, um, you know, identity is so fluid, and we're all navigating who we are in so many different ways over the course of our life. Like, I think that, like, if your identity is stagnant, and I'm not talking about your sexual orientation or your gender identity, but your identity more broadly is stagnant, that just means that you're like not asking interesting questions about yourself. And so when people come in questioning their sexual orientation or their gender identity, um, I mean, that's such rich therapy work to be able to help somebody piece together who they are and how they identify, and maybe find labels that resonate. Because I think a lot of people who come in saying I don't like labels, maybe they just haven't found the right label, or maybe they have been put in boxes and are very uncomfortable. I guess I'd like a more specific. I guess if the person who made that comment doesn't mind, I'd like a more specific question to answer, because I feel like I'm talking really broadly, and I'd be happy to answer any more specific questions that come up. Um, the webinar series, yeah, yeah, that's right. Izzy reminded me, we did the webinar series for sexuality with mental health professionals, which, like, I never heard back about. I don't actually know what happened with that. Okay, somebody said mental health often overlaps with spiritual care. Do you know of any ACE outreach in religious or spiritual arenas or resources? Um, can you clarify? Do you mean therapists who are spiritually oriented? Because we have one of those on our staff, if that's what you're asking. Or do you mean spiritual or religious facilities that also tend to mental health, which I would be probably like less familiar with? Let's see. As a therapist, I agree that therapists need more training. I teach future therapists and will use info to teach my students. Well, I'm so glad that you came to this talk and are going to take this information to help make a better future generation of therapists. That's very exciting. Um, Let's see. Questioning. It seems odd that we would need a letter for it. So, okay. So the person who had asked the question about the Q says that it seems odd that we would need a letter for it. And I think that the Q is in the acronym, which, like, you know, I was so happy when I found the phrase gender, sexual, and relationship minorities, which I sometimes just write down GSRM, because, like, it's such a cumbersome acronym, and no matter how many letters you put in, it's not inclusive enough. Like, when I spell out the acronym, I usually say LGBTQIAPK. That's usually the letters that I have, but I also know that there are a lot of identities that are not incorporated into that. PK is polykinky, if you're wondering. The I is intersex. And I think the reason it's important to include questioning, and I do believe that it's very important if you're going to use the acronym at all, which again is limiting, and which is, I think, like, I'm really happy the word queer exists and has been taken back and is now in general use, because it solves the problem of the acronym not being inclusive enough. But I actually think it is really important to include questioning, because otherwise people don't feel like they're welcome in spaces unless they have figured out exactly who they are. So the fact that that Q, or that second Q, or whatever you want to call it, is in the acronym really helps. It's almost like an invitation. It's almost like reaching out a hand to people who are still on their identity journey and trying to figure out what box they fit into. Um, Here's a comment. I'm one of the few ACE activists within the affirming theology / progressive Christian / side A world. So trying to see what else is out there, especially since most recovering from conversion therapy resources are for gay people. Okay, so 2 things. So I mentioned we have a therapist on our staff who specializes in the intersection of queerness and spirituality. He worked for a couple of years at the LGBT Center and is queer himself. Not ace, but he is queer. And he's a graduate of Antioch's LGBTQ track. They have like different tracks in their marriage and family therapy program. And he also is very into mindfulness and spirituality, not so much Christianity, I believe, but certainly into incorporating spirituality in working with queer people. The other resource that oh my gosh, I'm trying to remember her last name. There's this woman who I used to be in a consultation group with. Her name is Nina, and I will find her last name if you'd like it. And she is a queer Christian woman who specializes in helping queer people reconcile their orientation with their religion. So if that's a resource that you'd like, I can absolutely find that name for you. Let's see. Cool, cool. I think that is all the questions. I'm going to go ahead and grab this chat. I'm going to save the chat so that I have all of your email addresses and can go ahead and send out those slides. And if you have other questions, feel free to contact me. I will actually put my email address in the everyone chat because intake@throughthewoods.therapy.com goes to our actually, you know what I'll do? I'm gonna email you the slides, and so you'll have my email address. So intake goes to our intake coordinator, it doesn't go to me, but I will go ahead and send you the slides, and then you can email me if you think of any questions later, and I would be happy to answer them. So I so appreciate you guys and your engagement in this talk and your patience with this 1-hour talk becoming an almost 2-hour talk. And I wish you guys all the best.
Thanks everybody for sticking around, those of you all who could, and thank you so much to Jennie. This whole talk was her idea, so silent applause for her, taking the initiative and also putting this together and spending almost 2 hours with us now at this point in time. We really do appreciate it. Both everyone here in the chat, and on the call, and as well as everybody at ACLA.
Thanks so much, guys. And thank you, Sam. Thank you for having me. And have a good night.